In a world where pop hits are churned out of songwriting factories and based on proven sales-generating templates, today's guest is about as far from that ideology as possible. Kelly Joe Phelps was born 54 years ago in a farming state in Washington state. He learned to play music from his father, mostly country and folk songs, and later spent time as a jazz musician. But eventually Kelly Joe got a call to play the blues, and this year saw the release of his 11th album. If integrity, conviction and authenticity are hard to find today, then just take a listen to this man. He's flown in from his home in Vancouver, and Eastside Radio is very proud to welcome Kelly Joe Phelps ahead of his first Sydney show tonight, and we're giving away a double pass shortly. Kelly Joe, thanks for making the time to join us at 89.7 FM.
You're very welcome. Glad to be here.
Your latest album is called Brother Sinner and the Whale. I just love that title.
Oh, thanks.
Can you tell us a little bit about the theme of the album?
The theme is loosely based on a very short Bible story, the Jonah and the whale story. The record having mostly to do with the various ramifications of getting lost along the way, whether that's spiritually or otherwise, emotionally or something, and the places one can find themselves.
So, is that a reflection of your own experiences?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You have grown up in quite a religious family as well, I understand.
Yeah, it was all around in my childhood. I stayed with it a little bit in my early adult years and then turned away from it like a lot of people do and slowly finding myself being turned back to it, enough so to help myself make sense of the world I find myself in. I'm expressing or talking or singing about things that I know firsthand. So, in other records it was about other things, and this record it has a lot more to do with the spiritual journey.
What was the turning point for you to return to your faith and start introducing it again to your music?
There wasn't an epiphany or anything. It really was it had almost as much to do with exhaustion as anything. Kind of starting to slowly have that feeling of like, boy, am I going to make it another 20 years, 30 years, So it was that kind of just spiritual, emotional, and physical exhaustion. It's like, wow.
Going back to your early days, it was jazz, as I mentioned in the introduction,
Mm-hmm.
and then you sort of switched over to blues. What was it about the blues that drew you?
Prior to playing jazz music, I played any kind of music there was, because I just, I was still learning so much about music. But once I started meeting jazz musicians and finding out about improvisation, which I didn't know anything about prior to that, the art of improvising intrigued me no end, and it still does, really. And so I dived right into jazz music because I wanted to understand how these people were making up such great music on the spot, And that kept me enthralled for a long time. But by the end of that period, I started feeling like there were parts of jazz music that I really adored and other parts that I was starting to tire of. So then I started thinking about all the music I used to play before that and realizing that I was missing parts of that. So I started listening to lots of different kinds of music, again, acoustic music, because I knew I wanted it to be acoustic, which is another one of the things that I always loved about jazz music. Particular period, I hadn't paid much attention to the acoustic blues players or the country blues or the Delta blues players. And once I started paying attention to them, I realized that there was a lot of improvising that they were doing with that music, coming straight from jazz music and discovering what sounded to me like a folk music form that had a lot of improvisation in it. Essentially, was like, boom, that's what I want to do right there.
So it's quite a journey that you've been on.
Mm-hmm.
11 albums, that's really phenomenal.
Yeah, that's shocking to me even. I hear that or think it and I think, man, there's no way.
One thing about this latest album that I've really enjoyed and that makes it quite unique is that it's so stripped back. It's just you and the guitar.
Mm-hmm.
It must put you in quite a vulnerable state to release such an album that's so raw and so stripped back.
Yeah, that's interesting because you would be right in assuming that. It's strange for me because, I actually prefer that. I mean, I prefer the sound of it, but I prefer it as a musician or something. It's like I find more comfort in it, I should say, than trying to make a record with other musicians. So that's another one of the things I think that I realized I needed to get back to was just to simplify the whole thing. And, you know, and also that was so many of those early country blues records were that same way. You know, field recordings and things was just a guy or a gal and a guitar. You know, I mean, it's hard to get more pure than that.
There's a line in your song on the album, I think it's track number 6, called "Sometimes a Drifter," and it's quickly become on high rotation on my iPod.
Oh, fantastic.
And it has a line at the very end that says, and correct me because I won't remember, but it's something along the lines of "together in honest joy."
Mm-hmm.
And that honest joy seems to me a great summation of this album.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you for saying that. I hope you're not alone in that sensation, because that's definitely one of the big things I'm trying to put out there, you know, along with everything else. What is it? May we find in our togetherness honest joy.
That's it.
Which was that. It's not that, like, not painting it as overblown, or, you know what I mean?
Not
that
frivolous
sort of
happiness.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, but just like, almost like a release and
a contentment.
Peace. Yes, absolutely.
I'm talking to Kelly Joe Phelps, who's in Sydney touring his new album, Brother Sinner and the Whale, and we're giving away a double pass to his show tonight at Blue Beat and an album in just a moment. You love to play slide guitar and bottleneck, as some might call it, but there's a nice mix of fingerpicking and slide in this album too, which I've found is very, very pleasant to listen to, because it's giving a nice brevity to the album, and it gives it it's not weighted too heavily in any one section.
Right.
I know there are a couple of tracks that are quite heavy on the slide. Yeah, was that a conscious decision, or is that just how it all came about?
That was more of a conscious decision. Yeah. Again, I had played a lot more slide guitar on my first few records, and I kind of walked away from it, or turned away from it for a good few records after that. But when I started thinking about the songs for this record, before they were even being written, really, but just thinking about where I was headed creatively, it seemed like a good time to bring the sound of the slide guitar back in. And once I started thinking about it, I realized that I missed it as well.
There are few voices around who really are able to convey a story just with the tones in your voice. Katie Lang is one of the greats. You know, Bob Dylan was one of the greats. And there are certain feelings that those voices evoke in people's hearts when they hear that, and they're genuinely moved. And that's how a lot of people feel about your voice.
Wow.
Does that come as a
lovely.
surprise for you?
It is. It's a big surprise to me. It almost feels like I can't actually afford to think about it. And along with that is I don't actually need to think about it, because the last thing I want to do is become self-conscious about it. Only because the less I think about it, the more open I'll be to just do it.
That's right.
If that makes any sense at all.
It absolutely does. And I think, you know, with any artist, whether it's a dancer, a musician, you know, a painter, for example, with time and wisdom, you learn to slow down, and you learn to appreciate the gaps between the notes, which is where the real joy and the real beauty comes into it, I find. And that's what I'm hearing with your music on this album.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, that's great. Good news.
Earlier this year, Kelly Joe Phelps, you had to take a break from playing. You had a problem with your arm, with your wrist.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, I had a problem with my ulnar nerve, which runs along the inside of one's arm. It's almost every doctor I talked to gave me the same example, which was when you hit your funny bone and your arm goes numb, that's the ulnar nerve.
How did that affect your playing?
I couldn't play at all for some months, yeah. And, oh gosh, it's one of those things where everybody has an idea about what best to do. But ultimately, it was one of those things where I had to rest it. I got a little bit of physical therapy and learned some stretches. That seems to help.
I'm wondering, during that downtime, did you have a chance to think about things other than music? Did you think about perhaps how your life would be without music?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought about it in two ways. It was... I mean, you know, not being able to play was the scariest thing I've ever known, and I've been playing for over 40 years, so all of a sudden to not be able to do it. Initially, I thought, well, this might be a nice break. I can just sit back and relax for a while, but, you know, maybe a month into it or something, it was like, I'm losing my mind here, man, you know, because I realized how important it is to me just to make that sound. You know, it's like eating food to me, so that was an interesting experience, and also I really had to figure out if maybe I wasn't going to be able to play quite like I had been again, because there's no guarantee that the feeling will come back, and there's also no guarantee that the problem won't reoccur. So, I've got all my fingers crossed.
Yes, so do we. Now, one thing I just want to talk to you briefly about is when I did some research on where you grew up, the city of Sumner in Washington State in the US, I discovered it's the rhubarb pie capital.
Hey, how about that?
They love their rhubarb, don't they?
That's really funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Each year there's a Sumner Rhubarb Pie Festival. There's a website, the city website actually, also gives tips on baking. There are 10 different pie recipes.
Oh, that's
and
fantastic.
And there's even something called a blushing rhubarb fluff.
Wow.
Can you please give any insights into this?
No, I cannot. But that's funny. I didn't even know that. But we certainly had rhubarb growing at the house all the time, and rhubarb pie. And what else did Mom used to make? Rhubarb.
Probably jam.
Yeah.
Rhubarb jam's always nice.
And maybe it was just called rhubarb sauce, like applesauce, but made with rhubarb. So yeah, we were always eating that stuff. Isn't that funny?